When the Jewish people of the 5th century BC immigrated back to Jerusalem after having been in Babylonian captivity, there was a sense that maybe they might in some way restore the great kingdom of Israel. And when we read the book of Nehemiah, we see that this just might be able to happen. Because the great emperor Artaxerxes in Persia has given them permission to return and has shined his favor on them. Not only that, God has provided this wonderful leader, Nehemiah, with these great skills and abilities to lead. And you even see in the text that was read for us, he's a very deliberate, planning kind of leader who goes and assesses all the challenges. And if you read through the book of Nehemiah, you see just how deliberate he is in the plans of his leadership. He's a great leader. And although this happens, and the Israelites from the tribe of Judah, who have really found their identity now as Jews, return back into Jerusalem with this hope of rebuilding the city and becoming the new kingdom of Israel once again. One of the messages of our text from Nehemiah is that kingdoms will ultimately fail, and kings will disappoint us. And you see this right in the midst of the example of the Persians, for example. Persia, this great world power. They were great once, and their descendants want to be great again. And there's saber rattling, and there's missiles launched, and what was going on back then continues to go on today. Everyone seems to want to have world dominance and power. And the Persians had it. They got it from the Assyrians, who got it from the Babylonians, who got it from the Egyptians. But then the Persians who had it for only a while. And they lost it to the Greeks. And the Greeks lost it to the Romans. And the Romans lost it to the barbarians. You know who they are. They are my ancestors. Maybe some of yours too, right? So you look at this text and you see just how fleeting this world dominance and power really is. I read this text and I think of what Paul says in Romans. I think of what Paul says in Acts. I think of all the various different descriptions of power in the New Testament. And on one occasion, Paul comes before the leaders in Athens on Mars Hill, and he says, "Nations rise and nations fall, but God is the one almighty over all." When you read a text like that, and when you see this story of Nehemiah, I personally am reminded of a visit to Portugal. Because do you realize the Portuguese saw themselves as the superpower of the world at one time? We stayed in a bed and breakfast. Easy for me to say. And one lady that we met there, she was telling us about some of the music that we would listen to in Portugal. You know that fado music? It's longing and sad. She said that kind of music is really an expression of a quality of character of the Portuguese called saudade. And this quality of character is this sense of longing and lost. And the way that this young lady described it to us is, we were once great. We once ruled the seas and we ruled the earth. But now we've lost that power, and we don't think, in fact, we know we'll never have it again. That's saudade. That's what they sing. They once had the power, and now they don't. Power is fleeting. It's for a time. You might be mighty in a moment, but then comes another one, and God is almighty over all forever. Now, when we have this lesson in our text that is suggested to us in the book of Nehemiah, we also have this, not only this description of the kingdom of Persia in the text, but we also have this description of the kingdom of Israel. And Nehemiah is just hoping that somehow God will restore this kingdom. And the text begins with this beautiful prayer. Nehemiah goes before the Lord, and he humbles himself, and he prays. And he confesses both his sin and his brokenness, and also the sin of the nation. And he thanks God for God's long-standing kind of love, a steadfast love that endures forever. And as Nehemiah gives this thanks to God, I think he's really reflecting what the psalmist in Psalm 30, verse 7 is talking about. We put our trust not in chariots and horses, but we put our trust and hope in the Lord. He's also, in a way, echoing the kind of prayer that Solomon had taught the people of Israel earlier in the United Kingdom when he dedicated the first temple to the Lord. Remember in 2 Chronicles 7:14, we looked at that text several weeks ago when we looked at the book of 2 Chronicles. And in it, he receives this word from the Lord. And it says, "If my people who are called by my name shall humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven, I will forgive their sins, and I will heal their land." And this is the message that Solomon got from the Lord in his time of prayer, and this is the kind of attitude that Nehemiah reflects as he goes before the Lord. He has this sense that although he wants this protective wall around the city, and although he wants to restore the kingdom of Israel, he realizes that it's going to take help from God, because we have this people who is broken. They've been broken for years. They've been dominated for years. In fact, many people talk about, this land of the Jews. And you know how long in the history of the Jews, the Jews have dominated that land of promise? About 3% of the time of history. The rest of the time, they were fighting for control, and they were being dominated. And so the Jews really experienced, what it was like to want a land and to want a place, but also to realize that God was bigger than all that. Last week, I actually made a comparison of the prayers that Zerubbabel, during the days of Ezra, prayed in the temple, and all the people prayed and cried out loud. I kind of compared that to the tears that Koreans will oftentimes pray. And I think I misstated. I think I called the kind of character and angst that Koreans feel, I think I called it pho. Now that's a big mistake, because that is Vietnamese noodles. And I'm sorry, that was kind of a mistake. Maybe I was hungry at the moment when I said that. But the Koreans have this word han. And that word han is actually much like saudade for the Portuguese. Except for the Koreans, they don't have a sense that we were once great and now we're not. They have this sense that we've never been great and we've always been dominated. And there's this sense of despair and grief, and yet in Christian Koreans that get together to pray all night long, many of them, in their prayer meetings, they'll just pray. Go meet a Presbyterian Korean. They ain't like the Presbyterians next door, let me tell you. These guys pray all night, all day. And there's this sense of han that has been a part of their characteristic. And it's kind of like that soldado, except it's even deeper in a sense, because they've always been dominated and they've never known a time when they haven't been dominated. And in many ways, I think that the experience of the Jews is a little bit like being between soldado and han. because the Jews thought of themselves as having been great. You read the annals of history, and you'll read about all the great kingdoms around the Jews. And yes, there's footnotes about the time of Solomon, but that was a great time for the Jews. But quite frankly, God somehow orchestrated things all around them that the big powers around them left them alone during that period. And so they have that one brief glorious moment, but they've always kind of been dominated by people around them. And there's this sense of, now what does it mean for us to be God's people? And that's a question that Jews had to ask themselves, because when you don't have a land and you're not at the temple, how is it that you can be a people? And what became so important was the law. And the prophets taught them about how you take the law with you. It's the character that you live by. We're talking about a kingdom, not of this world, but a kingdom of God. A kingdom where you reflect God's justice and God's truth. A kingdom where you reflect God's kindness and God's mercy. A kingdom where you reflect a sense of concern for that person in your midst, for that family person, that child, that wife, that stranger in your midst, and you care for people around you. That's the kind of kingdom that the prophets, during all the period of Israel's history and the Jewish history that came following the kingdom that was united, was trying to say. God is doing something over and above us. And I think that sometimes when you're a superpower, it's hard to get that message. When you're always a winner, it's hard to get that message. The Jews were not the New England Patriots. And they weren't even the Atlanta Falcons. They were more like the Cleveland Browns. And they had always struggled for a sense of identity. And yet they knew their identity because they knew the law. And they knew God's goodness, and they knew God's grace, and they wanted to live with that righteousness and that grace and be characterized by that kingdom above them and beyond them. And Jesus really summed up the law and the prophets when he says, in his own hometown, he comes walking into the synagogue and he picks up a scroll of the prophet Isaiah. And he reads, "The Lord has anointed me to preach good news to the poor, to bring hope to the prisoners, release captivity to those who have been blinded and who are outcast." And then he took that scroll and he rolled it up and he says, "Today, this kingdom promise is fulfilled in your hearing it." And with that, Jesus was announcing a new life, not just simply for the Jews. Many of the Jews who knew the moral law, but who found much of their identity more in the cultural law of how you dressed and what you ate, more than how you lived and what you did. And so Jesus said, look, I'm inviting people into a kingdom of love and grace, and it's not just for the Jews any longer. The way that it's explained in the Gospel of John is that God and Jesus is the branch, is a vine, and we are branches from him. And Paul, St. Paul, the apostle, talked about us being grafted onto that new vine together with the Lord. Every one of us has an opportunity to be in that kingdom work with God that Christ has initiated. Now, when you've always been the champion, when you've always been on the winning team, maybe you place your trust in horses and chariots. But when you've been, on the losing team, you might be more inclined to trust God. I don't know. My son, Grant, my oldest, he played baseball his whole college career. And he played every game. But unfortunately, they had a losing season every year. But one of the things he says about having been on that losing team, he said, actually, I feel like I am prepared to be a better salesman now Because how many of you are salesmen? You know, if you bat 100, you're probably doing pretty good. If you actually get 1 out of your 10 calls that actually responds, that's a good day. And so one of the things that we have in our text is a reminder to us that God is doing something above and beyond us. Now, Nehemiah does a great job. And it's very important what he does in protecting the city. It's wonderful, brilliant work. But I think a real lesson of this text is what happens at the end of the book in chapter 13. Because Nehemiah goes away, and he goes back to Persia, the superpower of the day. And then he comes back, and you know what he discovers? Everybody's sleeping. The temple that has been reestablished by Zerubbabel has fallen into disrepair, and worship has not been maintained. People who were dedicating themselves to the law of God were not following God's laws. And then even the wall of Jerusalem that had been rebuilt, there were people now setting up shop by the wall and at the gates in order to sell and do business on the Sabbath day. And Nehemiah was just livid. He saw all this, and you know what he did? He sees some people by the wall selling stuff, and he slaps them in the face. He even takes his hand, he grabs the hair of one person and drags them away. That's the great Nehemiah. You know, he knew he couldn't do it, and he didn't do it. And one of the messages that I get, at least out of the text, is there's got to be a better way. There's got to be a better way. And it's a way of the heart, Jesus taught us. Obviously, Jesus also said you have to be as sharp as serpents, but as gentle as doves. And when it comes to living the life of a Christian, in business, in politics, in the family, it takes some sharpness, right? But no matter what we experience, we're ultimately dependent upon the Lord. You know, from the national, international scene, I think I learned a good lesson years ago, back in the 90s. Remember when we had Desert Storm? When Saddam Hussein had invaded Kuwait, and our country was considering on whether to go to war? George H.W. Bush gathered a bunch of people together the night before we went to war, and he called our nation to prayer. And he brought a bunch of ministers into the Oval Office, and they prayed. And to me, at least, that's a little national application of what Nehemiah is calling us to do. Sometimes you got to make hard decisions, but if we ever think that it's the horses and the chariots that give us our security, we might want to think again. Our ultimate security rests in the Lord. Let's go to him now, shall we? Let us pray.